I always knew my family didn't take me seriously. To them, I was just the one who never quite figured things out. My older brother was a high powered executive. My younger sister landed a six-figure job right out of college. And then there was me, the one who decided to start my own business. It wasn't a tech startup or something glamorous. I ran a branding and design service, helping small businesses create their logos, websites, and marketing materials. It wasn't flashy, but I loved it. I poured everything into it, working long nights, constantly improving my skills, and slowly building a network. But to my family, I was just wasting my time. Every family gathering felt like a game where I was always the loser. They'd sit around swapping stories about work promotions and pay raises while I sat there waiting for the inevitable. "So, still doing that little business of yours?" They always said it with a smirk, as if they were humoring a child playing pretend. My uncle, who prided himself on being the family's biggest success story, never missed an opportunity to remind me of my supposed failure. "You know, at some point, you'll have to grow up and get a real job," he said once at Thanksgiving, chuckling as if it were harmless advice. "Playing entrepreneur is cute, but it doesn't pay the bills." My parents weren't as direct, but they didn't have to be. Every dinner was the same. My father would beam with pride as he talked about my brother's latest promotion or my sister's incredible work bonuses. Then a moment of silence would follow before he sighed and turned to me. "And you, what's new?" It was always the same tone, pity mixed with disappointment. The few times I tried to explain my progress, his response was always dismissive. "That's nice, but when are you going to think about stability? Something with benefits?" Even when my business started growing, they refused to acknowledge it. They never asked how much I was making, never showed any interest in my clients, and never celebrated my small victories. To them, I was struggling, and nothing I said could change that perception. The worst moment came during Christmas dinner. My cousin, scrolling through her phone, burst out laughing and turned the screen toward me. "Look at this," she said, still laughing. "Broke entrepreneurs trying to convince their families their business is real." Ooh, everyone joined in, chuckling at my expense. My sister, always the one to twist the knife, smirked. "I mean, come on," she said, shaking her head. "How much money can you really be making?" I wanted to say something, to wipe that smug look off her face, to make them see they were wrong. But instead, I simply smiled. "More than you think," I said. They thought I was just being defensive. They thought I was embarrassed. But what they didn't know was that just a few days earlier, I had signed a client that would change everything. A client so big that when my family found out, their entire perception of me would shatter. They had spent years mocking me, belittling my dreams, and treating me like a failure. But soon, they would realize just how wrong they were. For as long as I could remember, I had always been the outlier in my family. My brother and sister followed the traditional path: college, prestigious jobs, climbing the corporate ladder. It was what my parents expected, what they valued. Success in their eyes was defined by stability, a high-paying job, and a name people recognized. I was different. From a young age, I had a passion for design, branding, and creativity. While my siblings focused on textbooks and exams, I spent hours sketching logos, experimenting with website layouts, and learning how to create compelling visuals. When it came time for college, I chose a degree in marketing and design, which was the first time I saw the disappointment on my parents' faces. "You're too smart to waste your time on something like that," my father had said. "You should be studying business, finance, or law, something so real." But I stuck with it. I graduated, excited to carve my own path, only to realize that the real challenge wasn't just building a career. It was proving to my family that I wasn't making a mistake. I didn't go the traditional route. I didn't apply to big companies or chase corporate jobs. Instead, I started small, working with local businesses, helping them refine their brand identities. It was slow, inconsistent, and terrifying at times, but it was mine. My parents barely acknowledged it. When my brother landed a job at a Fortune 500 company, my mother threw a celebration dinner. When my sister got her first major bonus, my father beamed with pride. When I announced that I had successfully completed my first set of client projects, they barely looked up from their plates. "That's nice," my mother said, "but are you sure this is what you want to do long term?" The doubt was constant, and it chipped away at me over time. No matter how hard I worked, no matter how many clients I landed, I was always seen as the family disappointment. The worst moments were at family events. My uncle, always eager to remind me of my supposed failure, took every opportunity to belittle my career. "Freelance work is fine when you're young," he'd say, sipping his expensive whiskey. "But eventually, you'll realize you need a steady job. You can't just live gig to gig forever." At every gathering, I was the punchline. My siblings and cousins would talk about their salaries, their promotions, their work trips, and then, without fail, someone would ask, "So how's that little business of yours going?" They didn't care about the answer. They were waiting for me to admit defeat. I was making money, more than they thought, but they never asked how much. They never asked about my clients, my projects, or the skills I had developed. They assumed I was barely scraping by, that my business was a temporary phase before I came to my senses and joined the workforce like everyone else. At one point, my sister even suggested I apply for an entry-level job at her company, and I could put in a good word for you, she said, as if she was doing me a favor. It's a real job with real benefits. You wouldn't have to struggle anymore. Struggle. That's how they saw me. Not as someone who was building something, not as someone who was carving out a path of my own, but as someone who was failing. And then came Christmas dinner, the moment everything changed. When my cousin showed that meme about broke entrepreneurs, when my sister laughed and asked, how much money can you really be making? I knew that was it. I had spent years biting my tongue, letting them assume whatever they wanted, letting them believe I was the failure of the family, but I wasn't. Because what they didn't know, what none of them had any clue about, was that just days earlier, I had signed a client so big that their entire perception of me was about to change. After that Christmas dinner, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was angry. For years, I had let them mock me, brush off my hard work, and treat me like I was wasting my life. I had swallowed their insults, endured their pity, and let them believe that I was struggling. But they were wrong. I wasn't just running a small business. I had built something real, something valuable, something that was about to explode. Just a few days before that dinner, I had landed a major client, one so big that even my corporate climbing family couldn't ignore it. I had spent months negotiating, refining my pitch, and proving my worth, and now it was official. The contract had been signed. I had been hired by one of the biggest luxury brands in the world to handle their entire rebranding campaign. This wasn't a small-time client. This was a household name, the kind of company my siblings would brag about if they even got the chance to work with them, the kind of brand my uncle's law firm would love to have on their client list. And I was the one they had chosen. Not a big agency, not some overpriced corporate firm, me. I could have told my family that night. I could have dropped the bomb right in the middle of dinner and watched their smug faces turn to shock, but that would have been too easy. I wanted them to feel it. I wanted them to see just how wrong they had been. So I waited. Over the next few weeks, I worked harder than ever. The luxury brands campaign was massive, and I was determined to exceed every expectation. I threw myself into the project, working late nights, perfecting every detail. And then, slowly, the signs started appearing. First, my uncle's law firm lost a bidding war to represent the brand. He mentioned it in passing during a family gathering, irritated but unaware that I had anything to do with it. It's a shame, he said. Would have been a good account to have, but they decided to go with an in-house team and an independent branding consultant. An independent branding consultant. I had to fight the urge to smirk. Then came my sister. She worked in marketing, and suddenly her company was scrambling to compete with the branding campaign I was leading. One evening, I overheard her on the phone complaining about how this new campaign was stealing all the attention from their latest project. I kept my mouth shut. Then the moment I had been waiting for arrived. The brand officially launched its new look with my designs front and center. It was everywhere: billboards, magazines, social media. My name was listed in articles about the rebranding. My work was being praised on major industry websites. And then my family saw it. My mother called me first. Her voice was hesitant. "Sweetheart, I saw this article about the new branding for..." It mentioned your name? I smiled to myself. "Yeah, Mom, that's my work." Silence. Then my brother sent a text. "Wait, is this you? This is huge." I let him sit with that for a while. Then, at the next family dinner, I walked in as if nothing had changed. I sat at the table, listening to their usual conversations about work, promotions, and salaries. Then my uncle cleared his throat. "I saw your work on the luxury brand campaign," he said, trying to sound casual. "That's impressive." My sister, looking like she had swallowed a lemon, mumbled, "Yeah, I didn't realize you were working with them." I just smiled. "It's funny," I said, picking up my drink. "For years, you all thought I was struggling, thought I was wasting my time. Turns out, my little business was worth something after all." The room was silent, no laughter, no smirks, just the uncomfortable realization that they had been wrong about me all along. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely in control. The silence at the dinner table stretched longer than ever before. For years, I had been the joke, the one with the little business, the one who needed to grow up and get a real job. But now, I had their full attention. My uncle, always the one to act like he had the final word in every conversation, shifted in his seat. He was never at a loss for words, yet now he seemed to be searching for something to say. "Instagram, he finally muttered, forcing a chuckle. I have to admit, I didn't see that coming. I smiled, taking a sip of my drink before responding. That's funny, I said, because I did. The look on his face was priceless. My sister, always the one to downplay anything that wasn't directly related to her accomplishments, folded her arms. Okay, so you got a big client, she said. Her voice unusually neutral, but branding is different from corporate marketing. Your work is more creative, I let out a small laugh. Oh, absolutely, I said. Creative work is why companies spend millions on branding each year, I tilted my head. By the way, wasn't your company recently struggling to keep up with a rebrand from a competitor? Her jaw clenched slightly. I wasn't just aware of my client's impact. I was aware that my campaign had directly affected her company's performance. That was when my brother finally spoke. Wait, he said, shaking his head as if trying to process what was happening. You're telling me you landed luxury brand? That's who hired you? I nodded, keeping my expression calm. His eyes widened. My brother worked in finance. He knew exactly what kind of numbers we were talking about. How much are we talking exactly? He asked, his tone suddenly more serious. I took my phone from my pocket, unlocked it, and slid it across the table. My latest invoice was open on the screen. He picked it up, scanned it, and his entire face changed. He blinked, looked at the screen again, then slowly passed the phone to my sister. Her smirk vanished the moment her eyes landed on the number. Then she let out a breathless laugh, not because it was funny, but because she was in shock. That's, she started, but stopped herself. She handed the phone to my uncle. He took one look at it, then cleared his throat and placed it back on the table. That's more than my yearly salary, my brother muttered. I shrugged, picking up my phone. Yeah, and that's just the upfront payment. There are still project milestones and additional work on the way. Oh, and they already referred me to 3 of their partners. No one spoke. For the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking at this table. I wasn't the one being laughed at. I was the one holding the power. I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the moment. The weight of what had just happened settled over the table like a thick fog. For the first time in years, no one had anything to say. There were no sarcastic remarks, no dismissive chuckles, no patronizing suggestions about finding a real job. They had mocked me for years, convinced that my small business was nothing more than a hobby. But now, they were looking at me with something I had never seen before. Realization that they had underestimated me. Realization that I had been quietly outgrowing them all while they had been laughing at me. My sister took a sip of her wine, trying to compose herself. I mean, branding is a growing industry, I guess, I smirked. That was the best she could come up with? You guess? I asked, tilting my head. Because last I checked, your company just had to restructure their entire marketing approach because of the impact my client's rebrand had on the industry. You do realize that was my work, right? Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. I turned my gaze to my uncle, the one who had always acted like he was the smartest person in the room. And your firm, didn't you guys bid to handle some of Luxury Brown's legal work recently? He stiffened. That told me everything I needed to know. They decided to go in-house, he muttered, clearing his throat. Yeah, I nodded. They did, but not before they hired me to handle their brand repositioning, and funny enough, I was actually in the meetings where they discussed which firms they would and wouldn't work with. I let that sink in. His face twitched, and for the first time in my life, I saw something I never thought I would. He looked uncomfortable. My mother, who had been unusually quiet this entire time, finally spoke up. Sweetheart, she said carefully, I had no idea your work was so serious. I smiled. That's because you never asked. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but then she simply closed it again. My father, who had always been the most vocal critic of my business, was still staring at the table. He had been silent for far too long, and I could tell he was struggling with what to say. He finally let out a slow exhale. I won't lie, he said, shaking his head. I never thought this would work out for you. I raised an eyebrow. Yeah, Dad, I got that. He sighed again, but I was wrong. The words weren't dramatic, they weren't a full apology, but they carried more weight than anything he had ever said to me before. I wasn't looking for validation anymore. I didn't need their approval, but watching them all struggle to process the fact that I had built something they could no longer ignore, that was satisfying. I picked up my drink, took a slow sip, and looked around the table. The power dynamic had completely shifted. No more jokes, no more dismissive glances. They finally understood, and they knew they had been wrong all along. After that night, everything changed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there. A shift, a hesitation in their words, a new awareness that they had never shown before. For years, I had been the one they pitied, the one they subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, mocked. I had sat through every holiday, every gathering, listening to them discuss their careers, promotions, and salaries, while my work was brushed aside as a hobby. But now they knew the truth. It started small. A few days after the dinner, my brother sent me a text. Hey, just wanted to say congrats. That's a huge deal. Just a few words, short, simple, but coming from him, it might as well have been an admission of defeat. Then came my sister. The one who had always told me that corporate jobs were the only real path to success. The one who had suggested I take an entry-level position just to have stability. I was working late one night when my phone buzzed. It was her. Quick question, do you have time to review something for me? My team is analyzing your branding campaign for luxury brand, and I figured since you designed it, maybe you could share some insights. I sat back and stared at my screen for a moment, letting that sink in. She wasn't just acknowledging my work, she was asking for my help. I typed a short response. Sure. I didn't say more. I didn't need to. I wanted her to feel that shift as much as I did. Then came my uncle, the man who had spent years reminding me that my business was cute but not serious. I was scrolling through my emails when I saw his name pop up. I might have a client looking for branding work. Can I send them your way? I didn't even blink, just typed back, of course. But the biggest shift? My parents. For my entire life, I had wanted them to believe in me. I had wanted my father to see my work as valuable, my mother to brag about me the way she did with my siblings. And now, suddenly, she was. A week after the dinner, she called me. Sweetheart, I was talking to Linda. You remember her, right? She runs that boutique in town. She needs a branding expert. And I told her you'd be perfect for the job. I raised an eyebrow. You recommended me? Of course, she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. You do amazing work. I let out a slow breath. This was the same woman who months ago had begged me to consider a real career. And now she was sending clients my way. And then the moment I never thought I would see, my father changed. Not in some big dramatic way. He didn't give an emotional speech or admit he had been wrong all these years. But one evening he called me out of nowhere, no reason, just to talk. And for the first time, he asked about my work. Not in the way he used to, not with that forced, polite tone that suggested he wasn't actually interested. No, this time he really listened. And at the end of the conversation, there was a long pause. Then he said it. I'm proud of you. I didn't need those words. I had already won. But hearing them, it felt good. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the family failure. I was the one who had proved them all wrong. After years of feeling like the outsider, something had shifted. I wasn't treated as the struggling entrepreneur anymore. My family now spoke to me differently. There was no more eye rolling when I mentioned my business, no more dismissive comments about when I would get a real job. Instead, there was curiosity, interest, respect. For the first time, they saw me as an equal. But I had no intention of letting them back in so easily. For years, they had made me feel small, unworthy. They had laughed, dismissed, and ignored my work. And now that I had proven myself, now that I had built something too big for them to mock, they suddenly wanted to acknowledge me. It was too late. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't holding a grudge. But I also wasn't going to forget. I had done this without them. And I wasn't about to let them pretend they had supported me all along. The real test came at the next family gathering. It was a few months later, and this time, I walked in with a different presence. I wasn't nervous about what they'd say. I wasn't dreading the conversations about jobs, careers, and stability, because now they knew. As soon as I stepped in, my mother immediately pulled me aside. Sweetheart, come here. I was just telling everyone about your amazing work with Walmart's Best Way. You have to tell them about it. I almost laughed. This was the same woman who once told me she wished I had chosen a safer career path. Now she was bragging about me? I humored her, giving a short but confident summary of the work I had done. I didn't go into unnecessary detail. I didn't need to. They already knew. My uncle, the one who had spent years condescendingly asking when I'd get a real job, now spoke to me with careful respect. Business must be good, huh? He said, trying to sound casual. I smiled. Very. My sister, who had once laughed at my struggles, now sat quietly, watching me, as if she was reevaluating everything she thought she knew about me. And then my father, who had never once acknowledged my business as legitimate, did something that truly shocked me. He asked for my advice. I've been thinking about rebranding the website for my firm, he said over dinner. Maybe you could take a look at it sometime? I set my fork down, staring at him for a moment. This was the same man who had mocked my career for years. Now, he wanted my expertise. I took a slow sip of my drink before answering. I'll think about it. I didn't owe them anything. I wasn't here to prove myself anymore. I had already done that. I was simply here to enjoy the quiet victory of knowing I had won. Because in the end, the best revenge wasn't just success, it was making them wish they had believed in me sooner.